this roundtable that we organized for the first international symposium of our university, of UOC. The title is The Challenges Posed by Higher Education Worldwide. I'm Josep A, director of the university, and I'm fortunate and privileged to have at this roundtable such relevant researchers and worldwide class researchers. So, Professor Manuel Castells, Professor Helga Nowotny, Professor Brenda Gourley, and Professor Martin Carnoy. So I just have to say that. I just say that it's an honor and privilege, and I hope that we will all learn from the discussion that will follow the presentation. We'll have the 5 presentations, and then we will open the debate. So since I'm the first one, I'm going to start with my presentation, where I try to summarize what we would like UOC to be as global university in the system. So first of all, and very fast, just for those of you that you might not know what our university is, our university has a community of more than 60,000 students, and up to now more than 40,000 graduates. In fact, our students come from 105 countries, mainly from Catalonia, 45,000, and the rest spread all over the world, larger numbers in Spain and Latin America. The miracle of UOC is how it's managed, and it's managed by a team of high quality with only 256 faculty members, almost 500 administration and management staff, 86 researchers, and then a large community of instructors and collaborators, which reaches almost 3,400. Some of them coming from other universities, but most of them coming from private institutions. When we look at the evolution of our graduates, we see that since 2003, 2003, when we started to our students started to finish their degrees and masters, the numbers have been increasing steadily and reaching now, what I said before, more than 40,000. And for the evolution of the number of academic staff, we started with a low number of academics, but this number has now increased up to these 260 and these 3,400 collaborators, instructors. In terms of our structure, we offer courses on bachelor degrees, master degrees, postgraduate courses, doctoral programs, short courses, and company training. And we have 7 academic areas that you have here on the slide, and most of you know, and 2 research centers, the IN3, Internet Interdisciplinarity Institute, and the eLearn Center. The university was created in 1995, and it's a public institution, privately managed. These should be properly made clear this year through the budget of the Generalitat. We hope that this would happen in December. This will probably happen in January, due to the fact that the budget of the Generalitat will not be approved this month, probably, as you all know. We get from the Generalitat less than 30% of the budget from the Generalitat, and most of all our personnel is non-civil servant working on the contracts. We have 3 virtual campuses in terms of language, and it's an open university in terms that it's online and if you want, distance university, but it's not open in the sense that requirements are necessary to follow our degrees and masters. Once said that, let me say that as we said before, UOC was born in '95 as a totally online university, and we all learned, at least I started to learn recently that when ICT is incorporated into education, this requires a change in the pedagogy and the didactics of the courses. So this therefore means that the profile of our academics is not the same profile as the academics of face-to-face universities, which our academics have to adapt to this incorporation of technologies to pedagogy. And this has a strong effect on the structure of the university. And this is our asset. This is also the difficulty that other universities wanting to move to online education are facing. But this is our asset, and we have the right organization to perform the job that we are doing. The model consists in the learning model consists in resources for the students. The students are tutorized or accompanied during their progress in the courses, and there is collaboration among the students. That's the whole secret, but our secret is well known. Other online universities show the same kind of structure in their methodology. We do it better, but the system is well known everywhere. So learning model affects directly the structure and the governance of the university. Once said that, who is our e-learner? We prefer to call our students learners because learning is something more dynamic than just sitting back and studying. Means that there is an involvement of the student in the process. So we call them e-learners. The average age of our e-learners is 35 years, and these are people which usually have a family, a mortgage, they are busy, sometimes they are employed, and therefore they are demanding. They are demanding towards the university. They want things done and properly done. On the other hand, they get competences and values. What are these competences and values? Competences and values that, on the other hand, a recent study performed or directed by our economic area studies, academic area of economics, was showing that from the point of view of the headhunters, they appreciate the values that online learners get in a university like ours. And what are these values? The capacity to learn autonomously, the capacity to work of teamworking and networking, the capacity of organizing their own time, the culture of effort, determination and toughness. So these are values that our type of education transmits to our studies, to our learners, and which are very well appreciated by companies. But what is a university? When you look at the at internet images, you see that there are pictures like the one on, I don't have a pointer, but the one on the top left, it says learn, as if by pressing a button you would learn. That's highly misleading. It doesn't work like this. The other image that you get is that by putting the books on your computer, you get all the knowledge you need. It's just putting the books in the computer and getting back the content of these books to the computer that you learn. And that's wrong, that's false. And on the other hand, I say that we are a university because we are asking questions and we are looking for answers. And what we have to do, there are many answers in the world. The problem is to get the right questions. And that's research. So we are looking for the good questions to be answered. And research is substantial to the university. That's why we are here today, and that's what we are promoting, that we should lead in research. And finally, when you look at the possibilities of the future, could we have a bionic body? Yes, maybe we can have a bionic body. And one of the ideas of bionic body is to get a chip in the brain so you get the computer connected to your brain. But that's not what a university wants to do. At university, you structure your mind. You learn how to think. Therefore, it's not just a question of transmitting knowledge from the computer to your brain. It's a question of setting up your personality, setting up your mind, making critical citizens out of the education at university. And what's the trend in higher education globally? Well, we are finding recently that in these recent years, there are more than 3 million students, undergraduates, studying in countries which are not their own. So flying away from their country to study in the United States, United Kingdom, and you name it, China, wherever. So there is an increased recruitment of students all over the world and an increased recruitment of faculty members all over the world. That's something that our system, Spanish system, doesn't find easy. In Catalonia it's different because we have ICREA program where we can get talent from everywhere. So we can get this increased recruitment of faculty. But that's not possible in the Spanish system, as you know, because the system is based on civil servants. But that's how the world is moving. Then the most important universities in the world are setting up branches in some other countries. And we are finding that, for example, New York University has a big branch in Abu Dhabi, or Yale has a campus in Peking for agriculture, or MIT has just opened a branch in Russia, in Sokovo. So you are finding that big universities in the world are opening branches all over the world again. On the other hand, this is a parallel movement, is the mobilization of big amount of funds to create world-class universities, again, all over the world. China's investing, India's investing, so Saudi Arabia is investing to get these world-class universities. Apart from that, we get efforts from online universities and for-profit institutions to fill the needs, to fill unmet needs of markets, higher education markets all over the world. And I will refer to that later on, mainly for the for-profit institutions. And then we are faced to the rankings of universities. And that's something that we have to understand, that our rankings are there and they mean something. And there are countries that have already said that they will not pay grants to their students to travel overseas if the university where they are going is not in the top 200 universities. So this is happening, and we have to understand that as well. And what are the challenges and opportunities for our university? So we find that there is a growing need for online education. Sorry about the graphs that I got from internet, but you see that's a study from California University where they see that the expenses are growing while the revenues are stagnant. So this poses a problem because you cannot keep growing in number of students. The lower one is the demand of students, and below you have the budget that you have to pay for the services you provide. So this means that there is a push for more online education, which is cheaper. The graph on the right shows the demand of face-to-face positions and the online positions. On the other hand, we are seeing that there are global needs for higher education. This is again California University drawing a cartoon that I found on the internet. There's a growing student demand, but the face-to-face traditional colleges can only offer a certain number of positions. And this means that the university offers online education within the university, but again, there are other actors, other players that are acting outside this system. So, need of higher education. You find that in, this is for California, but you can imagine how many universities should be built in China or in Africa in the next years or decades to fit these higher education demands. On the other hand, there is an emergence of a digital generation. So the old guy like me says, I'm a digital immigrant, and the young guy says, I'm a digital native. So that's the big difference, and we found the three kids which have a screen in front of them. Probably there's a television also in front of them. So they are working with many screens at the same time. So the generation is changing. Moreover, we are faced with ubiquity and mobile devices that will provide this facility to get into these digital facilities, and facilities that should be should enter education as well. So you have tablets, computers, smartphones, but then within the smartphones you have a variation of models and capacities, etc. So this is growing and growing, and we have to be we have to know and take care of that. On the other hand, the other challenge and opportunity is that probably that is impossible to increase the number of face-to-face universities with public funds for reasons of economic sustainability. This is on the left you have the campus that I found on the internet of Wake Forest in the United States, but on the right is the pharaonic campus of Alicante University. So how many pharaonic campuses like Alicante University can Spain sustain in the future? So that's a question that we should ask ourselves and see how these will evolve. And then the challenges and opportunities, again, for the emergence of new online, I call them low-cost education models. On the top left, you find Ashford University, which I don't know, which compare the services and quality that student gets from a profit and a non-profit university. And you see that the profit university, the satisfaction is lower than for the non-profit. On the right, you find this cartoon showing that sometimes these multinational multimedia companies are offering education at a cost, but they are for profit. So we should put a question mark on the quality. And probably they are not universities in the sense that we want to be. So probably they are not concerned about research, for example. And just the third one, I found that also in internet, the American University of London awarded an MBA to a dog. So just, that's also in BBC Newsnight. This is the dog that got the MBA. Just by paying and filling the forms, the dog was awarded the MBA. So that would be terrible if we were compared to these type of universities. But this may happen because they are online and they are offering degrees and they are offering higher education. So we have to face that. I'm just being provocative. There are more serious efforts and companies, but that's just a possibility. And that's what sometimes, that's the reason why we need to be accredited by a system, and that's why we are fighting to get our degrees and our masters accredited by accreditation agencies. Because if we get the accreditation, we will never provide an MBA to a dog. And then the increased competence of face-to-face universities moving to online education. And one example of this move forward are the MOOCs. Well, there's been a lot of discussion in-house about the MOOCs, and I have to say that I've been talking with a lot of you, and it's been very difficult to get a position. And I have to say that I still don't have a position. Although by talking and reading the blog and talking to Tony Bates, I'm starting to get a position, which is not all that favorable. In fact, when you see the map, and that's very recent because that's the map that the representative of the European Commission presented at SCOP, which was the meeting of rectors of online and distant education a couple of weeks ago in Lisbon. We see that in Europe we have 376 MOOCs and 129 come from Spain. So that puts me in some doubts. So if Spain is the maximum MOOC provider in Europe, then I have a question mark. But sorry? Well, I don't know. I know Spain.
How many in Catalonia?
Quite a few. I don't know. I don't have the number. I know that, for example, Universitat Autònoma has 4 in Coursera, but I don't know about others. There are 58 in Universia, so coming from Valencia, coming from different universities in Spain. And then the other one, I found the other one is the abandon or the number of people that get to the end of a MOOC course. So I know you cannot read it because it's very small, but it depends on the course. For example, the one that has more success with 36% is one which is provided by Edinburgh University on horse nutrition. So what tells us? This tells us that sometimes, and that was the criticism by Sebastian Thrun in an article just a couple of weeks ago, saying that well, you know that Udacity has got some problems, and Sebastian Thrun is saying that MOOCs have been a failure because people succeeding in MOOCs are those that have already got their training, and therefore that they are quite useless for people which have no previous training or no previous education. So this breaks the whole meaning of a MOOC. But there is still a lot of discussion, and I still think that MOOCs may have a place as a resource more than a course to educate in a certain area from the basics. So that's something that we still have to look at. But for sure, this is a first and important move forward from face-to-face university towards online. The big problem is that these universities have identified MOOCs with online education. And if the bubble of MOOCs blows, then online education may suffer. Because if we identify MOOCs and online education, that would be bad for us. Because if the bubble of MOOCs blows, then we would be identified. So we have to keep an eye on that. And finally, the adequation, we have to look at the adequation of our education to social, professional, entrepreneurial needs. So we should fill the gap between the needs of the student and the job. And that's what we call employability. But we have to look at employability from the demand, not from the offer. What's the demand of companies? What are the demands of society? How can we approach the demands of society to the education we provide? And that will give our graduate the possibility to be selected. Just let me say that Luis Conde, which is a very important headhunter in Spain, just gave me this equation for selection. I don't say that Luis Conde is right, but it's his point of view, and therefore is good to consider. He says that the employability or the selection for him as a headhunter comes from an equation where A is the attitude of the candidate. So attitude is very important because it's a factor in the equation. So if the attitude is proactive, and that's good. If it's a lazy guy and doesn't dress properly, then you see that things may not go very well. And then you have another one, which sorry, I have. Could we? Is somebody with a computer to? Because I cannot. I don't have.
Yeah, shut it down.
They are going to reinitiate. Please go to the computer because I cannot do it. I don't have the mouse. So you find that attitude which multiplies an addition where you have K, which is knowledge, T is talent. So this means that if you have a very high knowledge, maybe you don't need so much talent. You are very talented, maybe you don't need such big knowledge because you will acquire it. So it's not the reasoning here is not bad. Knowledge and talent should be together because, and then V is values. And at the end, this means that attitudes and values are a very important asset for the candidate to a job. Well, just I put a question mark because I don't know whether it's true or not. But this means that for a university like us, if values are important, we have to transmit these values. And we talked at the beginning about the values that an online university is able to transmit or to give to the graduates. And now it doesn't work, mine. Oh, no. Okay. So, and I finish with this slide. What are the future goals of our university? The first one, what we would like to see when I leave in 6 years, is that we have approached the situation where the university is global and inclusive. Global means that it addresses to the world, that we prepare students for a global world, but that we are inclusive. Inclusive in terms that people with different characteristics can be graduated with us, from ranging from disabled people to people which need some special type of education. So we should be able also, in that sense, to personalize, to include characteristics that are local in certain areas where our education can reach. Second one is that we should be accredited in our learning methodology and quality. We have to assure quality, we have to assure our learning method, which is the most important. We've talked many times about that. Our learning method is our strength, and this should be accredited around, recognized, and we should assure quality. The third one is that we should be working in a world-class research. So our research should be world-class. The fourth one is that we should be economically sustainable. And the last one, we could put others, but that we should be oriented to employability of our graduates. That's our mission towards our graduates. But we should keep in mind some strategic issues to reach these goals. The first one, you can read that, you cannot read that, but a diamond is just a piece of charcoal that it had handled stress exceptionally well. So if we want to become a diamond and not a charcoal, we shall need to sustain a lot of stress and determination. So that puts a stress in the house. So we should be ready for that if we want to be a diamond. I don't want to be charcoal anyway. The second one, that's from sorry, this is too small. I don't know whether maybe you can see it here, but sometimes there are trends. Here it says that, wait, there is something that's not going right. And the other one answers, you moron, do as you have been told to do and follow the herd. So maybe sometimes we don't have to follow the herd. We are a different university with a different type of academics. We have to recognize our personality, and we have to do what we have to do, and maybe not follow the trends all the times. Be aware of what's going on, but then follow our own pace. And the last one is that we should find equilibrium within the iron triangle, which is well known in health. The iron triangle is cost, access, and quality. So when you move one of them, the other two are affected. If you increase cost, you decrease access, but you increase quality. If you increase access, then you probably lower the cost and lower the quality. And if you increase quality, maybe you increase cost and you reduce access. So that's an equilibrium that we have to find and know to which type of students we are addressing, so to keep this situation in a good equilibrium and that provides us the future that we are looking for. And that's it. Thank you very much. Okay, and now Professor Manuel Castells, which is the president of the Scientific Commission of UOC, will have the floor.
Thank you very much, Director. Try to, the division of labor in this panel, I was asked to propose a few reflections on the role of the university and the transformation in the university system in the so-called global information age. Let me start by pinpointing that study was published 3 years ago by the journal Science, the leading journal in the scientific field. Was a study conducted by 2 graduate students, one German working with me at the University of Southern California, and a Chilean student of the UOC. And this was the first study that most of the scientific community acknowledged was able to methodologically, convincing ways to evaluate the amount of information in the planet and to provide a vision of the trends and also of the platforms where this information is currently being processed. So the study showed that by 2007, the latest data they could get, about 97% of total information in the planet was digitized, and 80% of that available over the internet. The important thing is that by 2002, meaning only 5 years earlier, there was only 52%. So the exponential growth of information in digital way, which allows, of course, to recombine it, and the distribution and the accessibility of this information over the internet has led some superficial commentators, particularly in the media, to talk about the glut of information. We are going crazy with information, etc. We always going crazy with all kinds of things. But the issue is not a matter that we have too much information. The matter is that the human mind should and must develop the capacity to knowledge, process, recombine, and act upon this growing mass of information. So the issue is how we can transform the capacity of humans to search, select, process, and recombine information to transform it into knowledge, and this knowledge into meaningful knowledge that refers to the task they want to perform for their personal lives and for their working lives. The building of this capacity depends essentially on education at large, and also, but not solely particularly, but also on the higher education system. But it's not education in general. It's a special brand of education. It's education that I call creative education, an education that fosters creativity, understanding by creativity the capacity to create new knowledge or new meaning as the source of wealth, power, and well-being in every dimension of the human experience. And what is required in this is essentially to enhance the autonomy of the learning subject, to stimulate his creativity, so that he or she will be able to process the information available in the internet for the purposes of his endeavor. In other words, information is in the network. The important thing is not so much more and more information in our mind, but more and more capacity to deal with this information. Of course, there are a number of pedagogical and technological procedures that are being incorporated into the education system to fulfill this task. But the main issue is that the obstacles for this fundamental transformation of our educational institutions are not technical, but they are social, cultural, institutional, and ultimately political. So let me try to first of all identify what is the specific role of the university in this context, then refer to these particular obstacles, and then try to see the lines of action that appear to be required to overcome these obstacles. So the university in our context is the fundamental productive force of the knowledge economy and the knowledge society. This is quite obvious. But so it is science and technology are the drivers of material progress, but also the drivers of what I would call sustainable material progress, because they have to be included into a holistic vision of what development is, which is not just increasing the GDP, but increasing whatever has to be increased to develop the human well-being, which is a different approach. And that requires a key combination between science and technology in general terms, and the capacity to develop the human mind in understanding and applying this science and technology, which of course include decisively such things as humanities and the arts. Second major role of the university is providing the human resources, the training of labor for this particular type of economy and these particular types of society. The third key element is that a revamped university system, a dynamic university system, able to absorb without losing quality the training of an increasing number of human beings is essential for equal opportunities. It is not true that people are over-educated. Certainly education has to be targeted to specific needs of the economy, but fundamentally the most important thing is to know that the educated people always have greater chances than non-educated people to find a job, even in a tight labor market or in a market characterized by unemployment. So equality in society, in our type of economy and society, translates into great education for everybody as a way to equalize opportunities. And then fourthly, we are living increasingly in a multicultural world and an interconnected world in which the ability for each culture to assert its own identity is fundamental, not to be lost in sort of an undifferentiated culture controlled by the cosmopolitan elites. At the same time, this ability to assert the identity of each society has to be related to the capacity to interact, to dialogue with other cultures, which also is part of the multicultural education of our institutions. In the specific terms, this translates into a number of key operations in the university system. The most important one is the first one. Which kind of persons are we producing? We need to produce in a society that changes constantly, with technologies evolving, with cultural models and patterns of personal life constantly changing. For instance, families. For instance, the relationship within the family, the relationship between men and women and children, which is the most fundamental change of the last 30 years is there. And therefore, the circumstances of life at this point cannot be predicted by anyone, by any individual person. Therefore, we need flexible personalities, personalities able to adapt to constant changes in the personal life and to constant changes in the professional life. That's why lifelong education becomes essential, to be able to constantly adapt to the new requirements of the economy, of society, and also of the evolution of culture and technology, but at the same time also to adapt to changes in the personal life. So this requires that our systems of education should be concentrating on very flexible personalities that are not afraid of change, that therefore are very autonomous and very able to reorganize their lives, their jobs, their ideals as fast as possible. But to do that without disintegration, we need people with strong values. Not many, not too many. If it's a matter of having dozens of values, a whole list of what should be good, then it's ineffective. No, a few values. Don't kill, don't rape, don't steal, at least don't steal illegally, because otherwise, to steal illegally, you have to close entire business schools. So, in other words, some basic elements of human values, decency, dignity. You see, all these movements in the world now, they have one word in common: dignity. So a few key human values, these should permeate education. We could not have a purely technocratic education, and this is not only a moral admonition, it's a practical way. How you constantly change your life without getting lost. That requires strong root in solid values. Second, production of knowledge and technological innovation is essential, and this is what really justifies, in many cases, the productive role of the university, and that's why countries and companies require more and more a university that is capable of producing knowledge. That requires the research, but that requires also a flexible system in which this research is connected to application, is connected to productive applications in the economic organizations. Therefore, this connection between the scientific university and the entrepreneurial university is more important than ever. Third, we also need a different type of worker and a different type of employable person. For me, the critical thing is what I call self-programmable labor, meaning labor who is able to reprogram her task depending on the changes in the working organization, in the technology, in the context. That is, the notion of skills that are forever, or they are for the long term, is obsolete. Skills will always be obsolete. This notion of the practical knowledge, you only need the practical knowledge. This is absolutely wrong according to international experience. In that sense, to a large extent, and Martin knows much more about this than me, so he will correct me later on, but the notion of the vocational school as the ideal school is from the industrial age. It's a different thing now. The important thing is to instill the capacities in the human brain to constantly rearrange the knowledge that is required, and then look for the information and look for a specific training that is going to change 4 years later, 5 years later, constantly. And in that sense, it's fundamental that the university organizes two things. First, not specialized formation, but the capacity to constantly evolve toward new specialization. And second, to organize the updating of these skills all along life, and that's where online universities can play a fundamental role. Thirdly, in terms of both training and research, interdisciplinarity is fundamental, and therefore the notion of knowledge communities that come together from different angles in treating, developing certain forms of solving problems, understanding issues, is fundamental. You see, disciplines are not, epistemologically speaking, are not rooted in any objective knowledge. Disciplines are peace treaties between warring factions in history, in the history of science and academia, in which, okay, we reach here, here is chemical physics, here it's physics, here is chemistry, here is biochemistry, and this evolves. This evolves. Bioengineering. Our rector is a great researcher, really acknowledged internationally in bioengineering. Bioengineering has had a lot of problems in the scientific community to be considered a field of research, which is not a discipline because cuts across different fields. Now, this is not only for leading research. This is truly to influence the entire organization of work and teaching in the university and the ability to connect different fields in different programs. So programs could be issue-oriented, but the academic discipline should be mixed into these particular fields. Of course, with some basic knowledge that has to be rooted in the tradition, but certainly the most advanced universities these days are experimenting with regroupings which don't follow the traditional disciplines. Fifth, in a globalized economy and a globalized culture and a globalized institutional system, we need a global networking of universities. And this is different from internationalization. Is different. Internationalization means that a university goes international. Global networking means that you work in the network globally all the time. That's where science is produced these days, in global networks. No single institution can actually be a standalone institution. MIT or Cambridge cannot be alone, have to be in a global network. And that's important from less well-known universities because it means that if you have specific knowledge that is important in one particular field, let's say research on information technology and society, you can have your ticket of entry into that global network, even if you don't have all the excellence in research in every field. But if you have some niches, you are in the global network, and this distills over the rest of the university. 6, the more universities are immersed in a globalized world in constant change, and the more we need autonomous universities, the more we need the autonomy of the management of the university. Because we need units that are flexible enough that can adapt rapidly. Imagine if every time that universities have to reorganize their academic programs or their research orientations, we have to request to the Ministry of Universities and Research or Education in Madrid, or for that matter, some bureaucrat in Brussels that oversees the operation. Well, they are bureaucrats, and let's understand that. And bureaucrats depend on the relationship within the power systems and the relationship to politics and to the political interests. They don't know. They impose their power, but they don't know what to do, and they don't know what they are doing. Well, this conditional sentence that I use, imagine that. Well, no, don't imagine. You know that this is what happens, that universities very often have to follow, for instance, the doctoral programs, exactly what some bureaucrat in the ministry, the day had stomach pain, decided that the doctor should be this way and not that way, with no control, no accountability, no control by citizens or the academic community. So we do have to fight to have an efficient university for as much as possible for universities that have strong autonomy. But this requires at least 3 things. First, requires a strong authority at the top. You know what? I like one thing very much in the UOC, is the rector of the UOC has real power. Does not have to negotiate with too many special interests. At the same time, this has to come with mechanisms and channels of participation so that the community feels engaged in a dialogue, in a discussion, but once the discussion is finished, decisions have to be made and not to be renegotiated, rediscussed all the time. This is what a modern university is. And this, by the way, had nothing to do with public or private. The public universities in the United States are also led strongly from the top, with control from the faculty, in some cases with participation of the students. And this is the third point. Participation of the students is crucial. But it's crucial in non-demagogic ways. Students cannot govern the university, period. Cannot. You know why? Because they are there 4 years or 5 years. They are not, their life is not there committed for the long term. But at the same time, they are the ones who can feed back to the administration, to the faculty, etc., can say exactly what is good, not good, what is their interest. But this is not about politics in general, ideology in general, which is very good, that all the citizens, that certainly the students can have their own views and mobilize and protest. But in terms of the governance of the university, their contribution is essential within the limits of not being the ones who have to decide, but being the ones who have to control what's happening, because after all, universities are supposed to be for the students and for the students' interests, not only because they also have to produce research and knowledge, etc., but the fundamental target of the university is the good education of the students. And this is the issue. Universities have to be autonomous. Universities have to have their capacity to really organize themselves as they intend to in relationship to the fundamental changes that we are experiencing. But we can only do that. We can only claim autonomy if we assume our responsibility and acknowledge the incredible privilege of what is today to be working in universities, doing research, the most exhilarating human experience, teaching, having a wonderful relationship, which is the pedagogical relation connected with the students, etc., and being quite protected in terms of job in general, and not necessarily civil service. There are many other forms of protection which are not civil service, and also the space of freedom that the university represents is actually the only space of freedom in society, the only one. It's the only place where they cannot fire you because of what you say or what you think. Well, this is an incredible privilege. But what is the problem? Using this privilege, many academics use the university for their own interests. And, you know, I entered the university at the age of 16. I never did anything else, and I will end my life, if the life ever ends, at the university, within a university. So I'm the most university person in the world you can think of. However, I am ashamed of my colleagues and of myself very, very often, because the notion of defending my little turf, making sure that I am not bothered, oh, I have to publish in index journals. So students become a nuisance. My precious time of research, which this student wants now that doesn't understand something obvious, should understand. So students become a nuisance. Your colleagues, okay, let's see if I can take this data from my colleague for myself. And the whole thing is protected with a major discourse, with a solemn discourse about the academic freedom, autonomy, the libertad de cátedra. All this is what ultimately delegitimizes the university. And under such conditions, we should not underestimate the problems that exist today. Economic crisis, policies of austerity which are completely blind, and they are destroying the only source out of the crisis, which is more research, more innovation, more capacity to generate value with less spending, okay? But this is so, austerity policies are stupid, but they are, meaning they are there. And on the other hand, the market, which is very flexible and has sensors all the time, has discovered a fantastic new field for profit, which is the education market. What the rector showed before, huge demand for education all over the world. And even in conditions of unemployment, people still think rightly that if they are more educated, have more chances. So there's a huge demand for education, and shrunk government funding, and huge possibilities for capital to be invested for profit in this field. And this is happening. This is happening everywhere. And at the same time, there is also the idea of reducing costs in the university, which starts by putting more constraints on working time, autonomy, capacity by faculty to decide what they want to do. These pressures from the market and from governments are such that the university has to call upon the support of society at large to defend this tool of production, work, and culture that the universities are. But if we do not assume our responsibilities, if we do not reform ourselves, if we continue to repeat the medieval privileges of the university in a different age, we will not have legitimacy, and down the line, very soon, will be no security of job, no libertad de cátedra, no nothing, because the pressure between market and government will be too strong to resist. It's a generational matter, but the next generation of academics either are reform academics or will cease to be academics. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you, Professor Castells. And now, Professor Helga Nowotny, which is the President of the European Research Council, the European Commission, will have the floor. She will be talking on achievement and challenges of basic research in Europe.
Okay, let's start.
Let me take the chance to send a welcome to the persons which are sitting at the room 304, which are watching this debate by a closed circuit of TV. We will invite them later to participate in the debate. Thank you, Professor Nowotny.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. This is my last public appearance here as President of the European Research Council. And it's a very great pleasure to tell you a little bit about what we have achieved in these past 7 years, what are the challenges ahead, and how I see what still needs to be done. Let me take you back 7 years ago when there was no EU funding for fundamental research. The terminology does not matter whether you call it basic, fundamental, curiosity-driven, blue sky. We know what it means. It's the kind of knowledge production that moves into area of the unknown. And it is the knowledge production that will be the basis for future uses of technology, for all kinds of new knowledge that will be built on that, but we do not know as yet. So this research has an inherent quality of uncertainty, and this is why it is fundamental. Now, 7 years ago, it was up to member states of the European Union to fund fundamental or basic research, and the treaty at the EU level at that time was very clear in specifying the EU, through its framework programs, funds research that is advantageous to the competitiveness of European industry, full stop. Now, as we know, practice sometimes is different from what legal documents say. And in fact, in many areas of science and research, it was not possible to say this is basic research and here applied research starts. In the life sciences, just to take one prominent example, you cannot say, you know, in the morning I do basic research because I do work with a cell in a certain way, and in the afternoon I think about application. But whatever was funded in this way crept in through the back door, so to say. It had no space. It had no legitimacy. And so something very unusual happened, namely a radical policy shift. Now, it would be nice if I could assure you, somewhat echoing the words of Manuel, the responsibility of the scientific community, it would be nice if I could tell you that the lobbying effort that the scientific community had been carried out for years, you know, asking, we need European funding for what we believe is the basis of all the research that will count and enables the future. But this is not enough in the political world in which we live. So some other considerations had to enter, and one of the considerations had to do with the place of universities in Europe. It had to do with the fact that after the Cold War, a number of nationalized industries were denationalized. There was a wave of neoliberalism entering Europe, and all this pointed to the fact that universities, as the major producers of this kind of knowledge in Europe, were not really up to the kind of global competitiveness that we are witnessing today. And so in order to strengthen the position of European universities, this was one of the major reasons behind this policy shift. Now, what happened is history, and you know it. The European Research Council was set up 7 years ago, beginning with Framework Program 7. And the achievement is that it was set up and to make it work. So how was it made to work? It had a dual, and it still has a dual governance structure. It has, and this is very unusual for EU arrangements, a scientific council of 22 members, and Manuel was one of the founding members of the scientific council. And these 22 scientific council members were entrusted with the task to set the scientific strategy of this new body. The Commission, the European Commission, promised it would not interfere, it would guarantee the scientific autonomy of this body. And the European Commission kept its word. But there was the other part of the governance structure, namely how to implement the scientific strategy. And as you know, implementation and strategy in daily life, in routine matters, cannot be separated. So we were there being able to say what we would like to do, but for the implementation, we depended on the structure that came from the European Commission. And a great part of the difficulties we experienced in the beginning had to do with making these two parts of the governance structure come together. So what did we want, and how did we see this privilege and mandate that had been entrusted to us fulfill? We were very quick in deciding that we wanted to fund individual researchers, because they are the ones where creative new ideas come up. And we were also very clear in not having any thematic priorities. There are other parts of the framework program that look after thematic priorities. But our philosophy was and is, it is individual researchers, the top researchers, who know best where the frontier of knowledge lies, who know best where the hot and emerging topics are. And it's no funding agency in the world, no policy maker who knows better than the researchers. So we put our trust into the researchers. And of course, we had to set up a system that would allow us to find and fund the very top researchers. And so as a scientific council, it was our responsibility to select the very best evaluators that we could find. We decided from day one onwards, we would only have 25 panels to cover everything in the knowledge spectrum, if you want, from astronomy to zoology. But it's not about disciplines, because with 25 panels, you cannot put it in a disciplinary straitjacket. You have to have panels that are multidisciplinary, that cover areas. And of course, from the very beginning on, we included the social sciences and humanities as part of the German concept of Wissenschaft. It was still, the dominant shaping force of the science system in Europe in the 19th century. So with these very simple principles, we got started in filling our panels. By now, these 25 panels have been set up for the different schemes, and we have something like 2,000 evaluators working for the ERC. 18% from these 2,000 come from outside of Europe, so I can say we are the most international evaluation agency in the entire world. We have funded up to a little bit more than 4,000 grantees. And again, being a learning institution, we saw from the very first call that our distribution of funds between starting grantees, looking after the younger generation, and the established would not be what we had hoped for, because it was overwhelming to see how great the demand was, especially in the younger generation. When we started out, 2/3 of the funding went to established researchers, 1/3 for the young. Then we turned it quickly around, and today 2/3 of the funding goes to the younger generation, starters and consolidators. We have spent in these last 7 years almost 7.5 billion euros. As you know, each grant goes for 5 years. It is generous funding. Barcelona, as you know, does very well in the overall distribution of ERC grants. But the point is really that we are working for Europe, and these are some of the more unexpected consequences that we had. So we wanted to fund these individuals, but the individuals work at institutions. And so we see now that there are competitions for the first time among European universities and research organizations, something that did not exist before. You would never have any reason to compare yourself with the University of Edinburgh or Heidelberg or whatever it is. You work in your own national environment, and that was it. And so in some sense, the ERC holds up a mirror and lets countries, institutions, individuals in their own disciplines, in their own research areas, see very clearly where do we stand. Such is the nature of a pan-European competition. We also were able, and I think this is, again, one of these achievements and consequences that was not planned. We are able to see that we are raising evaluation standards in many national environments. We did not invent peer review, of course not. But we were very careful in monitoring, in coming up with very strict new rules for conflict of interest that, you know, were not normally being observed in many places, and many other facets of the evaluation procedure. We were able to raise the standards, and today the ERC is considered the gold standard for evaluation. We also saw, and again, this was not planned, that in several countries, the starting grantees who had been invited to an interview, which means they were really top people. Those who were invited to an interview, we knew we could only fund 50% of those invited. So everyone invited to an interview was very, very good. And there were countries who then said, we set up a scheme, we will fund those who have been invited, so in order to give them a chance to come back and try again. As you can imagine, with this enormous demand of for applications and, after all, limited funding, the success rate is only in the order of 12%. And even now that we know we have a larger budget, we also see rising numbers of applications. And if anything, the success rate will not go up, but rather down. So the competitivity will remain. We also see a concentration effect this is what you would expect in science. Excellence attracts excellence. And Robert Merton, sociologist of science, many, many years ago, showed the Matthew effect. Those who have already are being given, and how this works for science. And this concentration effect translates into numbers in the sense that 50% of our grants roughly go to 50 institutions. You may say, well, this is a lot. On the other hand, if you look at the other 50%, you can see there is a spread around some 550 institutions all over Europe. And what we can see is that among those institutions, there are several ones who have understood the opportunities that the ERC offers in identifying talented young people in universities to give them the kind of support that is necessary to bring them up to European level. Now, what are some of the challenges for the future? For the ERC, and this will be my first 4 challenges, for the ERC, it certainly, the first challenge is to maintain the high quality that we have been able to achieve. To stand for one criteria only, namely scientific excellence, not to be convinced, persuaded, pressured to admit other criteria that have been part of the way how Europe is funding research, development, and innovation. Means we have a legacy that we must preserve. And once you start to move away from scientific excellence only, you lose very quickly, and no one gains from it. So we have resisted this pressure, and sometimes it has been very difficult also, because we see the discrepancies that occur in Europe. We see particularly the new member states that have very few ERC grantees. We can understand some of the reasons, analyze the reasons. But if you are standing for scientific excellence only, there is soft measures that one can offer, but you cannot really step back. And I think this is the first challenge also for the future. Horizon 2020 brings some changes that have to do with the outsourcing of many of the activities. There will be many more executive agencies. And the ERC executive agency will get under some pressure in the name of efficiency to centralize services, et cetera, et cetera. This also needs to be resisted. But then there is the question of how to make Europe attractive also for the outside. And sometimes I'm being asked, don't you think that European funding should foremost go to people who are already in Europe? And then you just take what, it only takes one moment to think. In terms of numbers, the very best scientists in the entire world are still outside of Europe. So we want to be attractive, at least for some of them, to come and work here in Europe. And last but not least, we have also been very careful in monitoring the way how women and men scientists fare with ERC applications. We look very carefully at what happens at various stages of the evaluation. We look into possibilities of unconscious bias. It's not so much about discrimination or conscious bias. It's a lot of unconscious bias that shows up in the figures that we are monitoring, and we will also do that. But apart from this, I think there is a much larger challenge for the ERC, and that is the challenge to explain and to insist and to show to politicians and policymakers that investing in frontier research is the only way how you can secure the future. Politicians tend to think in short-term cycles, and fundamental research is an open-ended, evolving way of looking at the production of knowledge in the future. you do not know when and which kind of output you will have that you can transform into a technology that you can put on the market as an innovation. But looking back at the history of science and technology, we find overwhelming evidence that this is the way how fundamental research works, and to convey this confidence that this is the right way to go, I think this will be the major challenge. Now, let me come to try to formulate a message at the end for UOC. You may feel that you are far away from an ERC grant. Nevertheless, I would say there are certain messages in what I have been sketching here. And the first message I want to leave with you is see yourself as part of a global landscape. The rector has already pointed to this in terms of really having the students, but also see yourself as part of a global research landscape and try to identify your niche depending on the strengths that you have here, and try to identify your unique strengths and capitalize on them. My second message is the importance of investing in people, people, people. And this is the basic philosophy of the ERC, investing in people. And also, as Manuel has shown, it is part of the university mission. The overwhelming important part is really to bring forth a certain kind of personality and helping to identify and nurturing the talents through mentoring, through interacting with the outside, really to come up with a strategy how you can cultivate the kind of talented people you have. And this, of course, and this is my third message, it goes with institutional support that is targeting, and it means you have to have a strategy of institutional support, and you have to have mechanisms in place how you can nurture the talent in your midst, and how you can invest in people who will be the carriers, the producers of this new knowledge. Let me end here with a personal remark. When I started out, I was often asked, you're talking about excellence and excellence only. How do you define excellence? What are your indicators for excellence? And I was always very evasive, partly because me and my colleagues, we know you cannot cut down excellence to a one-dimensional matrix or matrix. You cannot cut it down to a one-dimensional indicator only. And in a sense, I may have been evading the question, but I don't think so when I said excellence, forget a sharp and analytic definition of excellence that you can attach to a number. Think of it as something that you recognize when you encounter it. This is a relational concept. It means you have to be able yourself to recognize excellence when you encounter it. And today I want to leave you with a slightly different attempt to define excellence. And this may perhaps reflect my learning experience over the years. And I would say excellence extends into three temporal directions. Excellence is built on the past, on outcome. This can be the short track record of someone who is just like a starting grantee 2 years past his or her PhD. But there must be some elements of excellence that comes from the past and that shows as outcome of a trajectory of the past. Excellence is rooted in the present as something that is an ongoing, a continuous process of striving for excellence in many different ways. And excellence is something that is directed towards the future as an ongoing aspiration. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Nowotny. And now Professor Brenda Gourley, which is ex-Vice Chancellor of the Open University United Kingdom, will talk about the new frontiers of distant higher education.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for inviting me to be here. What the President has described already as challenges and changes in the higher education sector, and indeed what Manuel Castells has described in his speech, tell you that there is a great deal happening in higher education, and indeed also a great deal not happening in higher education. If you typed the crisis in higher education into a Google search engine, you would get something like 145 million hits. What it tells you that all these things that you've heard us talk about so far together actually constitute a crisis in higher education. And it's not just part of higher education, it's not the distance education part, it's not the open and supported learning part, it's not the online learning, it's not the traditional learning, it's indeed the entire system. And so I don't think for the purposes of our deliberations today that it's very useful to divide the system into its different parts. Except to say to whoever here has some responsibility for the funding, that it seems to me that the funding model is entirely broken. But think about the fact that in many countries, and the UK is one of those countries, part-time students make up nearly half the percentage of the whole. So you've got this part-time and full-time. Some of them are at open and distance education institutions. Some of them are studying in the evenings at traditional institutions, at the weekends and what have you. That's how I studied many years ago. Some of them are studying online programs at traditional kinds of institutions. So the fact is that full-time and part-time are blurring, residential and online are blurring, virtual and real classrooms are blurring, and now, of course, the business sector and the public sector are also blurring. So I think for the purposes of this discussion, the differences don't actually matter all that much. The second distinction that I want to just make before I go on to the main body of my address is one that's been partly made for me by the President when he described the student makeup of the UOC. In fact, UOC is not entirely unique in that respect. When we see, many people and many policymakers, I'm sorry to say, think in terms of higher education, they think 18 to 25. That is simply not so anymore. In the world of lifelong learning, as Manuel talked about, in a world where the economic structures are changing so rapidly, in a world where we seek to give people much more opportunity to find their fulfillment, the age ranges are vast, and they range across learning needs. They have different learning needs, different learning styles. They want to learn at different times. So we've had an indication of that, and these, of course, are drivers for change. So with that as a background, I'm going to suggest to you, and there'll be a little bit of overlap, but I'll try and minimize that. I'm going to suggest to you that there are 10 changes in mindset that we need. We need those changes in mindset in the people who teach, in the people who govern, in the people who manage, in the people who assure quality, and in the people who fund higher education. And you might say, perhaps that the general public also need a change in mindset. So my first change in mindset is about the role of the university. Now we've heard something about the role of the university, and we could spend a great deal of time talking about that. But what should hold our attention, and does hold our attention, is that hundreds of thousands of our graduates are not employed. And we are being told by business and industry that many of us are unemployable. Now, something's drastically wrong there, and while I agree that not all university is vocational, except of course that there are doctors and lawyers and those kind of people, the fact is universities have to be much more intensely interested in the structure of the labor market, and they should be asking themselves questions about whether these tectonic shifts that will take place in our world, population stress, energy stress, climate stress, economic stress, etc., tell us that the past is no indication of the future. Now, as Emmanuel has said, I'll say it in different words, problems in the real world are seldom so kind as to divide themselves into disciplines, and that gives you an indication that all these big issues of our time are ones that universities should be embracing with some enthusiasm. So some indication of the role of the university bears intense examination. The second thing that I'm going to refer to is a shift in mindset about caring what happens to students when they come into a university setting, any university setting, online or otherwise. The fact is, except for the very elite universities, there is the most horrendous dropout and failure rate in universities. I do not think this is a sustainable or acceptable thing. Now, we can, people have all sorts of excuses. They will say to you, well, that's the student's fault, it's not the academics' fault. They might say, well, we are very concerned, but we haven't got the resources. Academics might say, well, we are concerned, but just remember, we are evaluated on our research, not on student outcomes. And all of those things have an element of truth in. But the fact is that students often admit far more students than their physical capacity can accommodate. The lecture theatres in today's world are not adequate to the 21st century. Teaching methods could certainly be better, and students' differing abilities to cope with the material are not taken into account. And this is in a world where we have adaptive content is available, where learning analytics are available, when all sorts of remedial software is available, there are all sorts of things that you can see around the room are possible. So the fact is that this is a waste that cannot be supported. And let me remind you, when we're talking about costs all the time, and that is one of the big drivers of the crisis, the cost of this is very high. Where the university is free to the students, the cost of the taxpayer is high. Where university education is not free, there's the cost to the taxpayer still, there's the cost to the student or whoever's paying. There's a financial cost, and there's also a psychological cost. Because let us bear in mind that the cost is not just borne by those who take a long time to get their degrees, but also by the countless millions who don't ever get a degree, and they're still weighed down by the costs that they incurred in trying. They still have all sorts of debts to pay off, but they've also still got this badge of failure that blights the rest of their lives. So I just think that's a disgrace, and it cannot continue, and we need to do something about it. I think it's a moral and an economic imperative. So that's my second one. The third one is how students experience education. And again, students, of course, are digital natives, a lot of them, not all of them, in this lifelong learning world. But nevertheless, when they come into universities, there are many universities, and I'm not saying all universities, and I'm certainly not saying what, because it's completely different. But the fact is, there are many universities whose student experience would not be all that different from the student experience of 50 years ago. You walk into a lecture theatre, you sit down, you have quite a dreary lecture, you walk out, who cares whether you pass or fail, whatever. It's not acceptable. And students know, of course, that there are all these marvelous resources on the web, like MOOCs, like those courses provided by MIT, Open University, iTunes U, TED, and others. And maybe they're not just taking those courses to actually get some kind of accreditation, although that's starting to come, but they're expanding their own knowledge, and they're often expanding it in the very subject that this university where they're teaching is supposed to be helping them. So we are seeing, and we are beginning to see more and more, that classroom time is being used differently, and that's good. And we're also seeing, of course, these MOOCs that everybody talks about. I come from Africa, where there's a huge lack of capacity to grow the educational participation that the population needs. And when you see the quality of the material on the MOOCs now, you know and you celebrate the fact that so many students in all sorts of remote locations have access to materials that were previously denied them. In Rwanda, for instance, they're setting up an entirely MOOC-based university, which means that they can have teaching fellows who can mediate the teaching experience with the students. But they would never be able to attract the kind of talent that would make that kind of content possible and whatever. I read that Microsoft Research are presently working on what they called massively empowered classrooms. Well, all I can say as somebody who's devoted some of my life to pursuing the cause of social justice, pursuing the cause of development through education, I think that what we've got here is something that is really valuable. And of course, the other thing that we're seeing, which is really interesting, is that students are taking matters into their own hands. There was recently a report published by the Chronicle of Higher Education called The Future of Higher Education. And what students are beginning to do is what the report calls student swirl. They're attending multiple institutions, and I quote, sometimes at the same time. They extend their time to graduation by taking time off between semesters, mixing learning experiences with internships, etc., mixing traditional courses with other courses with alternative providers like Coursera or edX, etc. So students are demonstrating at the frontier, if you like, that they want more choices, they want more flexibility, and we need to make it easy for them. My fourth thing is how long it takes to get a degree. Now, I have to say, you must ask the question, why does it take 3 years or 4 years or whatever it is to get a degree? 6 years, 7 years if you're part-time. Because if you take the average university year, and this is in many countries of the year, and you count up the actual teaching weeks, you'll find that only consumes about half of the year. Might vary slightly from country to country, but about that. So the rest of the time is supposedly taken up by the staff doing research, not all of which I would say was absolutely excellent. Sorry. But this is a system that's geared to the staff, not to the students. Now, some universities, under pressure of numbers, under pressure of costs, are giving alternative options. The University of Buckingham in the United Kingdom offers a fully accredited university degree in 2 years. It drastically reduces the amount of time that is spent in vacations or whatever you'd like to call them, study times, etc. But it's an exception. So what I'm saying is we could accommodate students, some universities do, but not very many. We could accommodate students who want to speed up the degree. We could give them acceptable options with choices delivered online by other universities. We could point them to the MOOCs and then examine them on what we've learned. We could offer them more start dates and opportunities to study courses other than ourselves. We could offer them different paces. We could have examination timetables that offer them multiple exit points. So I think it's time we stopped looking at the chronological year as something sacred. Stop imagining that the courses from one university and only that university are worth having. Stop limiting flexibility. Promote mobility in the best Bologna aspiration. and throw out the idea of this traditional student. The fifth change in mindset is about curriculum, and I think Manuel's adequately dealt with that, more than adequately dealt with that. There's a very good report called The Future of Learning, Preparing for Change. It's a European report, and it points to the emphasis on personalization, on collaboration, on informal learning. It points to especially finding a way to build bridges between informally acquired skills and formal accreditation. It points to the importance of creativity. All those things are very important, and of course what it means is that we have to find new ways of assessing students, new ways of testing competencies. My sixth thing is about how students learn, and we've got all sorts of research from the neurosciences. Some of the posters here today tell you about, but we know a lot more about how students learn. And we know they don't all learn in the same way, that we can modify our teaching methods, we can track them. We've got learning analytics, we've got remedial software, and we can track their journey and intervene at times when it's clear that they are battling. But it's not just our mindset that we have to change here, it's the teachers and the professors who have to become much more knowledgeable about how students learn. It's not just the idea that everybody learns differently. It's in the teaching and in the construction of the pedagogy and the construction of the learning journey that's going to be made available. Number 7 is about faculty roles and faculty training. Some people see MOOCs as a challenge to the very existence of faculty. I don't see it like that at all. I sometimes think about massively available textbooks that have been around for quite some time. Nothing particularly changed then. But the fact is that research shows that purely online, without any help at all, is not very successful. And certainly there's a role for the teacher to interpret the context, to contextualize for culture and circumstance, and all those kind of things. So there's rich explorations of the future, but the fact is that present conceptions of how faculty use their time, I don't think is in the best interest of this new world that I'm telling you about, and we need our best brains designing this new future. Number 8 is the fact is about quality, because when I describe all these things, it tells you that what constitutes quality is a whole different matter, and so what we need is for our quality assurance agencies to reconceptualize how it is that they define quality, how they go about the accreditation business, because all these new realities do not, they are not present in the quality assurance measures that we see at the moment. My 9th one is about scholarship. Manuel has covered a lot of that already, so I'm not going to repeat it, but the fact is scholarship with this vast amount of data, this huge computing power, is completely different. And we used to teach research skills in postgraduate students, but in fact, some of those kind of research skills need to be right in the undergraduate role. And the last change of mindset is about the role of management and leadership, and what can be managed and what cannot be managed, and what can be done inside a university and what cannot be done inside the university. And I think that management in this new world is going to have to be completely rethought. Now we're seeing that the professionalization of many functions is taking place in universities, much more in the way of strategizing and careful implementation, much more in the way of performance assessment. Nobody likes that, but there it is. Much more in the way of staff development for this new world, benchmarking, partnerships, collaborations, all those require change in mindset. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've given you 10 changes in mindset, which I think need to change in quite dramatic ways if we're going to cope with this very definitely described crisis in higher education. I've spent most of my life championing the cause of social justice and seeking to bring education to people who are previously disadvantaged. I'm not so naive as to imagine that the so-called digital divide might not turn into some sort of unbridgeable abyss, but I've seen so much innovation in the last 20 years that I am optimistic. What I'm not optimistic about is academics' unwillingness or willingness to change. So I have end with the statement that I think an inappropriate or a lethargic response to this crisis is endangering not only the future of those working in academia, the futures of all students, and indeed the health of our economies and our democracies. And if we don't change it ourselves, ourselves being academia, then somebody else is going to come along and do it for us. Indeed, they are already amongst us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gourley. And that's the turn of Professor Carnoy. Professor Carnoy is professor... Oh, sorry. Now it's working? Okay.
No.
It's working? Oh. Now. Okay, thank you. Yes. Thank you, Professor Gourley. Now it's the turn of Professor Carnoy. Professor Carnoy is Professor of International Education and Economics at Stanford University. And he's going to talk about the global transformation of the university system, China, India, Brazil, and Russia. He just published a book on this issue, just appeared last month, and so he's going to talk about this issue.
Es un gran placer de estar aquí con ustedes, pero voy a hablar en inglés porque para no ofender al resto del panel. So, the BRIC Higher Education Project was a result of, first of all, a huge collaboration, interdisciplinary, international, certainly aided by information technology. Probably impossible to do without the email and the internet and Skype. All these things facilitated this massive project. Its underlying model is that the state is the driving force behind higher educational expansion in the BRIC countries. Implicit in many of the talks, maybe all of them, that you've heard so far, is that the university is the driving force of change. This study does not agree with that point of view. It is the typical and traditional way that people have looked at change in the university system, as if universities were driving the change. Well, in these 4 countries, it isn't universities that are driving the change. It is the state that's driving the change. And it is very important to understand why and how the states accomplish what they have done, which has been a huge expansion after 1995. Our theory behind this is that universities are very important to the legitimacy of the state. There's a huge demand, as you've heard, for university education, as for all education, as the K to 12, kindergarten to 12 system expands, moves up, primary first and secondary. As it expands, people start competing with each other to go higher in order to get an advantage. The middle class begins demanding more places at universities. The state feels compelled to do this for a number of reasons, one of which is to enhance economic growth. The second thing is just enhance itself politically. Even if there weren't economic growth as resulting from university expansion, the state would still expand universities as it would the whole educational system, because this is what people want. Even if there is no economic growth resulting from it, people do have advantage from the system in terms of their position in society. So using this model, we analyzed empirically how higher educational systems change over time in the context of domestic, economic, and political forces and the information age global economy. And we also analyzed the implication of these changes for national and global development. One important implication of the model is that besides being a good model to analyze comparatively how university systems change, it allows us to evaluate the quality of states. How well and how effectively they expand the university systems is a very good measure of how effective they are as political economy systems in themselves, how effective the bureaucracy is. Because this is a major challenge for most bureaucracies to handle this particular project well. Most economic analyses emphasize the efficiency of markets and a degree of interference of the state in markets in evaluating nations' propensity to sustain development. And of course, the point of view of most neoclassical economists, neoliberal economists, is that the more interference you have from the state, the worse possibilities you have for economic development. Our point of view is quite different. Our point of view is that the more effective the state is, the better are your prospects for economic development. And the more effectively the state actually intervenes in markets doesn't mean more intervention's better. It just means more effective intervention. And expanding the university system is, in fact, an intervention in the market. And it's carried out mostly by the state in most societies. So, researching the expansion of the university system provides a lens through which to examine the effectiveness of the national state in shaping an institution that the state itself assigns a lot of importance to in promoting economic growth and reproducing its own legitimacy. So here is the first sort of important thing that I have to convey to you, and that is that university systems, if you haven't noticed, have expanded enormously over time, and they didn't do so altogether. The United States, which is the yellow line, expanded quite early, back even right after World War II. I mean, it was already, this is the number of students per 100,000 in the population. So it expanded already. It was already the highest per university attendance, enrollment back in the 1920s and 30s. But it had a big expansion right after World War II and reached very high levels by 1970. And the European systems began really expanding in the 1960s. Japan had an early expansion, then followed by another expansion in the 1960s, and then the Soviet Union, which is the sort of gray line that shoots up right at the end, had a major expansion already. It was the second highest by 1950, and then remarkably enough leveled off just when the U.S. expanded. And then you can see that after 1995, 3 systems expanded rapidly. One with a lot of students already, which was Russia. The second is China, which is the lowest line with the big dots, had this tremendous increase between 1995 and 2010. Brazil, which is the blue line, and then the red line is India, which is slower, but still making a big change starting now. I just wanted to show you the size of, remember this previous graph was per 100,000 population, but India and China have a lot more 100,000s than others. So this is the number of graduates of engineers, just of engineering graduates. No, I'm sorry, this is engineering plus computer science graduates. And you can see that all these countries increased the number of graduates, even U.S. slightly, between 2000 and 2010. And this is in absolute numbers. And so the first sort of impression that I want to make on you is that in 2010, China and India were producing between them 1,200,000 engineering graduates a year, per year. Okay, and this is a figure that gets people very excited, saying that this is the tsunami of high technology. So I will make you less worried over the course of the talk. But the important thing is that they're all increasing. It's just that, first of all, 30 in India, by the way, is up to, in the last 3 years, India's now at about 600,000. Okay, so the rate of increase in India is much faster than anywhere else. Oh, it went, okay. So here are 4 important findings that we, beyond this, beyond just the expansion, that first of all, the private payoffs, the rate of return on investment in higher education as a result of globalization has risen significantly all over the world, particularly in the industrial countries. Now, this is partly a result of actual demand for higher educated people going up, but it's also a fact of the downward substitution of higher educated people for less educated people. So it's forcing the return to lower educated people down. So even though salaries of higher educated people might not be going up in absolute terms, the salaries of lower educated people are going down. Therefore, this is still driving up the rate of return to higher education. And this is the case in the United States. The secondary educated workers, young workers, their salaries have gone down for the past 30 years in absolute terms, corrected for inflation. Higher educated with just a bachelor's degree have remained more or less stable and gone up more for females, less for males. Yet the rate of return has really been increasing. And this is true in China and India. I'll show you in a second. This is one major feature. As a result of this, the state has been able legitimately to say, you should pay for this. Because now it's evident to people that the payoff is growing to finishing university. So now, instead of giving it to you free, we're going to start charging you for it in one way or another. And normally, this would evoke tremendous reaction from students and families having to pay. But because the payoff has gone up, the reaction is more muted. Now, in some places, it's reaching crisis proportions, like in the United States, because the costs have gone up and people are taking a lot of loans. But the fact is that the state has been able to maintain legitimacy while shifting to private funding of university. I don't say privatization. It is partly privatization in the sense of giving it to private universities, but it's also simply cost sharing in the public sector. I mean, you can have a public petroleum company owned by the state, but you don't get your gasoline free. It isn't given away. So cost sharing is not exactly the same as privatization, but it is part of a shifting the university from being seen as a public good to a private good. Okay, it's a complicated issue. We don't have time to talk about it. But it's largely possible because the payoffs have gone up. Now, in some places, payoffs haven't gone up, and therefore it's very difficult to do this. Italy is a good example. Payoffs are pretty low in Italy. So people would go crazy if you started charging for it. Other places, like in France or Spain, the taxes are relatively high. So the middle class considers this one of their rights as part of their paying their high taxes. So it's a very complicated issue, but it's still a very interesting issue. In 3 of the BRICS, the state pursued a policy of allowing the cost per student to fall. Cost per student falling over time. And as they expanded, they did it cheaper. That was one of the ways they financed the expansion. Not only privatization, but making it cheaper. In addition, the gap in spending per student has increased between the elite universities, increased quite rapidly in 3 of the countries, between the elite and non-elite higher education institutions. So 3 of these countries, well, all 4 countries invest much more per student and much more subsidized in elite universities and charge students more as a fraction of the total cost in the mass universities and lower the cost of the mass universities. The iron triangle in this case, more access, lower quality, lower cost. Okay? So here are the private rates of return, and as I told you, they're either high, maintained high in Brazil. They may have gone down a little bit since the mid-2000s, but in China they've gone. Oh, rate of return is as if I would tell you this is the interest rate you're getting in the bank on your investment. So in this case, for every dollar in Brazil that you invest, you get a 25% rate of return per year of university. Not bad. Not a bad investment. This is the average. This is the average. This doesn't distinguish between elite and non-elite. This is just the average. Okay? In China, it's gone up from quite a low rate in 1990s to a high rate in the 20%. In India, it's remained constant but pretty high. And in Russia, it's, remember, this is a mass education system already at higher ed. It's gone up to 7% a year, so it's not bad. Here is the increasing proportion of students in private institutions. In India, it's had a tremendous increase. This is just private institutions, doesn't include cost sharing. In Brazil, it was already high, went even higher, and in Russia, it's gone up somewhat. And here's some differentiation in the cost. So here's Brazil. Brazil, the blue line is the public universities, and the red line is private universities, which includes, by the way, a few elite universities, which are quite expensive. So the cost has gone down. The black line is the average cost. That's Brazil. This is China. The 100 elite universities are the blue line. You can see more and more money being spent per student. The red line is flat. Those are the mass universities where 85% of the students go to university. In all these cases, 85% go to the cheap universities, okay? This is Russia. It's the only one that's increased cost per student. We only have data from 2006. But again, starting in 2008, they start investing more in the 39 so-called research universities, which are the elite universities. Now, here are the difference between elite and non-elite in engineering. And you can see that in China, now you don't have any more 800,000. You really have in elite universities closer to about, in 2009, about 130,000. So now you can breathe a little easier. There are not going to be waves of Chinese engineers going everywhere. For the most part, the engineers in the non-elite universities are more like technicians. They're not really engineers. Here's something interesting about Chinese universities. Nobody drops out. Okay, so you don't have to worry about Chinese universities because nobody drops out. Once you're in, you finish, 99% finish. In fact, there's an interesting case that I read about where the students attacked the professor for flunking a few students in the course, and he changed the grades. He felt that his physical security was more important than how he graded the students. So you can see that the elite university numbers are much smaller than the total number. And for all intents and purposes, in these 4 countries, Russia maybe it's not quite as bad, but in the other 3, the non-elite universities do not produce engineers of value. They can get jobs doing stuff, but it's not engineering jobs, not really engineering jobs. Now, there are plenty of them going to non-elite universities. To elite universities. Now, here's another indicator of the quality of the students, and that is that these are the entry PISA math scores of the top 5% of students. Top 5%. So you're saying these top 5% are going to be eligible for the elite universities, all right? So in the U.S., it's 637. In China, it's 680. This, by the way, is the average for all of China, not Shanghai. I am one of the privileged few to get data for the 9 provinces that really were tested in the PISA, not just Shanghai. And they, surprisingly, score lower than Shanghai. Okay. They still score very high, as you can see. Russia is at 609, but here's the shocker. The 2 provinces, the 2 states in India that took this test, this PISA test, in the PISA Plus in 2010, by the way, India didn't take the PISA in 2012 as a result of these results, they're far below Brazil. These are the top 5%. The top 5% are scoring well below the OECD mean. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean that the students in the Indian Institutes of Education aren't super smart, because they're not the top 5%. They're the top 0.001%. Okay, so they do very well. But I'm telling you, average elite university student, this is in mathematics, is doing not very well in India. Not very well. Okay. I don't know, maybe this is too much information for you, but research funding, another important criterion of how good universities are. I do believe that research funding is important for the quality of university. I think everybody at this table believes that. And you can see that countries like India and Russia spend almost nothing. This is per student, per university student. Spend almost nothing. Brazil spends the most of these 4 countries, and you can see it. If you go to Brazilian elite universities, you can see it. They're heavily research-driven. China, the elite universities have more and more money now for research, but this is pathetic in India. Look at it, it's pathetic. You can't talk about having a good university system if you're spending $91 per student per year on research. It's just impossible. And then you compare to countries like UK and US and Germany, who are spending massive amounts of money. Sweden's even higher, by the way. And then here are the engineering PhDs per year, okay? And you can see China, which is the purple line, goes up very fast. They have huge numbers of PhDs. Most of them are of low quality, but at least they're producing people who have PhDs who can teach in the universities. And then you can see that Brazil has a rather small population compared to India and China, but they actually produce they produce the same number of PhDs as in India, which has 7 times the population of Brazil. So I'm pointing you toward a very interesting kind of, oh, by the way, this is something quite interesting. We were able to measure in a very rough way the value added of an engineering education in the lowest half of the institutions in Brazil and the highest half. These are electrical engineers. Value added means what was their test score in the last year versus the test score in the first year. Okay, controlling for the test score. How much did you actually learn in the university on an engineering test, by the way? And you can see that the value added is higher in the most selective universities. That's scary. They actually have higher value added. But what's even worse is that the lower half students in the lower half of the universities by test score, they end up lower than the first year students score in the upper half, which is the blue line. They end up lower. The red line of the lower of the left-hand side is actually lower, the red line is lower than the blue of the right-hand side, which means you might as well just hire first-year students from the elite universities, more elite, the top half, it's not even elite, the top half, rather than hiring last year's students from the ones at the bottom half. That's pretty scary. That means it's really low quality. Okay, so summing up, university systems are a key element for states seeking political legitimacy for several reasons. They're associated with promoting economic growth. There's sustained high demand in the population for access for higher education. The rising private rates of return to higher education in these countries and in others, and these foreign and others, have enabled these states to shift much of the cost of the expansion to families and students. These states, particularly the two self-identified world powers, China and Russia, have decided to strengthen elite universities and use mass universities to absorb 85% of demand at low cost and low quality. Is this a wise strategy? It is a misreading of how the US and European university systems became great. But only time will tell whether a strategy of focusing resources like this will work, either economically or politically. So the whole business of world-class universities is actually a misreading of what happened in the United States and Europe. The United States and Europe had high-quality second-tier universities. There was a difference between first and second tier, but they still were high quality. I will tell you a strange factoid. San Jose State University, which is a second-tier university in California, and Cal Poly, California Polytechnic, and other public second-tier universities, produce more engineers for Silicon Valley than Stanford and Berkeley. Okay, they're not the people generally who end up running companies, but they're good, solid engineers that do the heavy work in a high-quality technology system, okay? So it's very important to understand, and by the way, the US is also turning to these kinds of strategies, the MOOCs are one of them, to say we can try to provide high-quality education on the cheap. Can I tell you something? You can't. Sorry, you're wrong. That's what Sebastian Thorne learned. Smart guy, not so smart, because he didn't understand this. If he'd asked me, he would have understood it. You can't, it's not going to work. I can talk to you about the MOOCs forever, so I'm not going to do that. Okay, so how effective, Stanford's one of the great big producers of MOOCs, by the way, with many of my colleagues who produce MOOCs. Okay, how effective, by the way, if you ask them if they'll ever do a second one, they say no. There's too much work. Faculty don't like to work that hard. So how effective have these 4 states been in expanding their higher education systems? What can we tell from our study about the effectiveness of these 4 states? What I learned from this is that all the hype about India being like the next great economic development miracle, I doubt it. The state is so disorganized. It shows in the way they've tried to expand their education system. It's very badly done. China, on the other hand, much better. Brazil, not bad. Russia already started at a high level. They've made terrible mistakes. They're even making mistakes as we speak. But they have a lot of leeway because they have 76% of their students go to university. 76% of the age groups goes to university, and they inherited a rather good system. It's deteriorating, but they inherited a rather good system, so they're in a different situation. But I would not put my money in India, I can tell you that. Thank you.